Okay, this is going to be a really quick recording, just an overview of this session because no one had, um, no one who had signed up has made it to this session. But I'll do a quick recording so that you can take a look at this later if you choose to view it. So, open pedagogy is basically situation or is involve assignments where students create or learning activities where students create rather than just consume academic content. And that content is shared, sometimes just with the class, but sometimes more broadly, publicly. And I didn't mean to do that. Okay. And as by its very nature, it's a form of active learning because students are actively engaged in the process. And one of the nice things about active open pedagogy is that the assignments that are created are what um, David Wiley referred to as non-disposable assignments. So many of the assignments that are given within the learning management system, students complete, they submit it, they have access to it perhaps while they are in the course, but as soon as or shortly after the semester ends, they lose access to it. And quite often, if they haven't saved it themselves, they no longer have any of the benefits from, well, other than the learning that occurred during that, they no longer get to keep the things that they had created. With open pedagogy, what happens is students create things that last beyond the current semester, especially when they're publicly shared. And open pedagogy projects often involve some type of service learning. For example, one type of open pedagogy is transcribing handwritten documents in archives and similar things, where there's often a public service involved in as part of this. Some examples. One of the first examples as part of this movement was annotating online content. Robin DeRosa was one of the founders of this movement in the United States, and her first use of this was when she was teaching a class in literature, and she noted that I think it was early American literature. I don't remember exactly, but what she noted was that students were paying quite a bit for a North anthology of literature when all the works that they were reading were in the public domain. So, what she had her students do is do the annotations themselves, because the reason why she was using Norton Anthology was because the quality of the annotations in it. But she thought it might be a more interesting learning experience if students worked through, did the research, and created their own annotations. So she did that, and that's where she got started in this whole movement. And many other people have followed, and we'll have some examples of that later. Another type of open pedagogy is where students publicly blog. We've had a number of cases on our campus where students who were doing a travel course created a travel blog where they're describing their experiences and what they were learning as they traveled through it. But this could be done for any number of approaches, and it's often done in writing classes where students reflect on their learning and so forth. Wikis are another type of open pedagogy project where students are creating some knowledge that becomes publicly available to others. There was an interesting discussion I heard on a podcast a few years back where there was I think it was somewhere in Texas. The students or the instructor was teaching a class in Portuguese, and he noted that there was no information on their city in the Portuguese wiki. So he worked with Wiki.edu, and he had his students create a wiki about their city, writing in the language that they were learning. So that was an interesting example of a wiki. Many years ago, I was teaching a course in the history of economic thought. And again, I was in a similar position to Robin DeRosa, where most of the readings that they would be doing were of materials that were in the public domain. So I had students create a wiki for that class. And basically, each student was asked to pick over the course of the semester one in the first third, one in the middle third, and one in the last third, either a major individual or major developer of economic thought, either a person or a school of thought. And they wrote that up, they presented it in class, and they got some feedback. So the students were doing a lot of the work, and they really enjoyed that. Another possibility is creating a glossary. One of the cases here was someone who was teaching in our theater department had students create a glossary of terms that Old English terms and sayings and so forth in Shakespeare's work, which were not obvious to a casual reader of today, and so on. But that could be done in many disciplines. Many classes have used podcast projects. I've done that 4 or 5 times, maybe 6 times now. I take that back. I think there have been 8 classes I've used podcast projects in. Video projects could also be used where students can create videos related to the subject matter and post them on YouTube or some other website. It may be a case where students are doing some research where they share the results of that publicly on a website or somewhere similar. I've also had students, not quite in the same way as Robert DeRosa did it, but students have created books related to what they were studying that semester. And we also had, well, I'll share some resources that links to several examples of this later. Some things to consider if you want to try doing an open pedagogy project. First, don't do it just because it looks like it's going to be fun, and it is fun, both for the instructor and for the students. Do it only if it relates to what you're trying to get students to learn. One other thing you should also plan for in thinking about an open pedagogy project is that some students may not want to have their information out in public. They may not want to write something that's shared or create something that's publicly shared. Sometimes people are involved in cases involving stalkers or maybe in witness protection, or may have some other issue where they may perhaps not be fully documented in terms of citizenship right now, which is a much more serious issue than it had been before the current regime popped into existence. So in any case, you may want to provide some options for students who do not want to post things publicly. I have actually not had this experience. Students always appreciated the possibility of doing this. But one strategy that some people use is just create an alternative assignment that's only shared with the instructor or perhaps with the class. Another possibility is if they're posting something publicly, let students do it under a pseudonym and so on. So there's a number of ways of dealing with that. Make sure that if you're going to be doing this, you come up with, quite often this is done and it's a form of group work, come up with some type of plan for student collaboration. How are they going to work with each other? How are they going to give feedback to each other? And so forth. And when I do it, I tend to have students break up into small groups and then develop some rules for the group, some group processing agreement, the group processing agreement that they then revisit periodically through the course of the semester. You should also plan for both peer feedback to make your workload a little bit easier and also so that students get more feedback and instructor feedback and revision. I put these slides together a couple of years ago and modified them a little bit, but we may also want to include some AI feedback because that's another way in which students can get more feedback than is possible for just their peers and just for the instructor to provide. But if you are going to have students receive AI feedback, be careful to talk about when it's appropriate, when it's not, what represents ethical and legitimate use of AI, and what might not be appropriate in your particular discipline and your particular course. Well, I guess I did include AI feedback. Another thing it's really important for students to be reminded of is issues of copyright and intellectual integrity, which certainly relates to AI, but more generally, students have not always been taught very much about copyright. And most of the stuff that is released under open pedagogy projects are done using some type of Creative Commons license. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that is something you may have to remind students of because they may have been used to just copying and pasting things that they found online. And reminding them of what the rules are for these types of things. And in general, my students have generally chosen an open license and have relied only on either public domain or materials licensed under a CC BY or similar type of licensing agreement. Also, if because these are things that often last beyond the class, you will have to make some sort of arrangements for a hosting plan. Some campuses have capabilities for doing that on their campus. We used to, but the college decided to stop funding that after a couple of years. But I'm funding it myself just because I want students to be able to create things that list go beyond the current semester. Specifically, I'm hosting the podcast, a site that allows them to, or that allows students to go back and revisit the podcasts they've created. Um, Another thing is, since much of the work tends to be group projects, make sure that you have some mechanism for evaluating the contributions of individual students. Make sure that each person is responsible for certain things and that their contributions are visible in some way. A simple strategy that I've used, which was suggested by Jessica Kruger when she was doing a book project with her students several years ago, is to have students collaborate in Google Doc and assign a color for each of the students so that whenever they wrote something as part of their chapter or their segment, that they did it in a specific color with a color code at the top, making sure, of course, that you maintain sufficient color contrast across the colors. But if the groups are 3 or 4, there are some nice dark, clearly readable colors against a white background that in general will tend to be, that will tend to meet those color contrast capabilities and still allow you to see the individual contributions without having to go back and look at the edit history of the documents. Another is making sure that all the work they create meets accessibility requirements because Title II requires that anything that students create and share publicly must meet the same standards that we have in terms of WCAG 2.1 AA requirements. So that was, again, that was something that students also faced or experienced as a bit of a learning opportunity that they might not, that many of my students had not seen before they were in this capstone project where they were working on creating materials that were licensed. I will share a link to this later, but here's a link to the licensing list, the Creative Commons licenses and so forth. And there it is. So the most common and what my students have always chosen so far, at least, is a CC BY, which means that anyone can use their work as long as they attribute it to them, that the original authors or receive attribution in whenever the work is used. There's a sample release form that someone had posted online under a Creative Commons license, and here's a link to descriptions of this. It also has downloadable little icons and JavaScript you can plug in and so forth for the licenses. So, one of the things to consider is what types of assignments are you using now? What types of open pedagogy projects might you like to try? And in general, these projects tend to be much more engaging than seeing many more papers on the same topics you've been seeing multiple years from multiple students. You get to see more of student creativity, and because they're being more creative and they're exploring topics that they find intrinsically interesting, they tend to do much higher quality work than if they're just jumping through the standard routine hoops that they face in so many of their classes. And here, I think it's the last screen, but this takes you to a website, which I have updated mostly. It was something that Judy Littlejohn and I created for a conference and the Online Learning Consortium conference pre-COVID actually, but it has been updated. And for each of these types of open pedagogy projects, we have some examples followed by some resources. The examples are links to open pedagogy projects. Here, for example, for student-created books, here's some examples, and in fact, a lot of them are mine, but there's also a few others in there, and there are many others. I just wanted to give you a few examples of these. And the resources are some suggestions on how to do this and so forth. And in particular, it includes some podcast discussions of that, et cetera. And here's some additional broad resources, some things created by SUNY, the SUNY Open Pedagogy Explorer, which came out also from a SUNY Fact 2 group. I say also, but that was the previous section, sorry. And there's a lot of examples of these things. And I think that is it. I encourage you to explore this. And it will go to here. But if you go back to that screen, there is a short, tiny URL you can use to get to the resources. And if anyone wants a copy of the, oh wait, sorry. I think, did I put in? I did not. I thought I might have put in a link to the slides. If you were in here in person, I would share that with you, but it doesn't look like I had that. So if anyone wants a copy, send me an email and I'll send you a link to the slides. But those resources on that last screen, I think, should be helpful to give you some ideas about potential open pedagogy projects. And I'm going to stop the share and I'll stop the recording. Anyone has any questions, please contact me and I'm happy to assist you. We've had quite a few open pedagogy projects on campus and I've enjoyed working with people and helping to set them up.